Hey everyone. Tonight we're traveling back to ancient Rome, a place where you could control half the known world and still get punished for wearing the wrong color, crying too loudly at a funeral, or walking around at night looking a little too alive. Before we begin, get comfortable. If you enjoy this kind of slow, thoughtful history, leave a like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. In ancient Rome, clothing wasn't about self-expression. It wasn't about mood, creativity, or identity. It was about sending a single, very clear message: how much trouble you were legally allowed to cause. Fashion in Rome wasn't art. It was a warning system. And the loudest warning of all was purple. Purple dye was absurdly expensive. It came from crushing tiny sea snails, each one producing only a microscopic drop of pigment before dyeing in the process. Thousands of snails were needed to color a single garment. The process was slow, revoltingly smelly, and depended on trade routes stretching across the Mediterranean. Wearing purple was basically announcing, "I own resources you will never emotionally recover from." Naturally, Rome put rules on it. Only emperors, senators, and the highest officials were allowed to wear large amounts of purple. A fully purple toga was the ancient equivalent of a flashing sign that said, "I have power, and you absolutely do not." It saved time. No debates, no misunderstandings. You saw the toga and you immediately understood the situation. To modernize, this sounds extreme. To Romans, it was practical. Rome was massive, crowded, and constantly tense. There were no ID cards, no uniforms. You needed instant visual clarity. Purple provided that clarity. It prevented accidental insults and accidental executions. There was also an economic reason. Romans were obsessed with status. If purple hadn't been restricted, wealthy elites would have destroyed themselves competing over it. Rome already knew what happened when rich men competed aggressively. Republics collapsed. Limiting purple was basically Rome saying, "Please stop before this gets stupid." Breaking the rule was no joke. Wearing purple without permission was treated as impersonating authority. This wasn't a fashion mistake, it was identity fraud, with sandals. So yes, Rome banned a color, not because it was petty, but because clear hierarchy prevented arguments. Arguments turned into violence. Violence destroyed empires. And if all that chaos could be avoided by telling most people they weren't allowed to wear fancy snail dye, Rome considered that a bargain. Grief worked the same way. In ancient Rome, grief was allowed. Uncontrolled grief was not. Romans understood that public emotion spreads faster than logic, and when it spreads, it turns dangerous. One scream became 10, 10 cries drew a crowd, and crowds made Rome nervous. So grief was regulated. Professional mourners existed. People paid to cry, wail, and perform sorrow. And even they had rules: how loud they could cry, how long they could mourn, how dramatic they were allowed to be. Because a city full of screaming mourners was one bad rumor away from a riot. Women, especially, were forbidden from excessive public displays of grief: loud wailing, dramatic collapses, hair-pulling, or self-harm gestures. Not out of hatred, but because those displays attracted attention, and attention created crowds, and crowds created chaos. Rome didn't care who caused unrest, it only cared that unrest happened. This wasn't emotional repression. Romans mourned privately, at home, with family. They cried, they remembered, they honored the dead. They just weren't allowed to turn grief into a public spectacle that could ignite political tension. Funerals were emotional, and emotional events were dangerous in a city already overflowing with ambition, rivalry, and rumor. There was also a class problem. Rich families could afford massive theatrical funerals. Poor families couldn't. If mourning became competitive, louder cries, bigger processions, grander displays, funerals would turn into status battles. Rome already knew where that ended. So grief was rationed. Think of it as emotional crowd control. Romans understood something we still struggle with today. Emotions are contagious. Anger spreads, fear spreads, grief spreads, and once emotions take over, laws stop working. From Rome's perspective, allowing unlimited public mourning was like allowing open flames in a grain warehouse. It wasn't cruel, it was preventive. And then there was dinner. In ancient Rome, dinner never was just dinner. It was politics, performance, psychological warfare, sometimes served on silver. So Rome regulated that too. These were called sumptuary laws. They controlled how much food you could serve, how many guests you could invite, and even which ingredients were acceptable. Not because Romans hated enjoyment, but because they had learned a dangerous truth. Rich people do not stop flexing on their own. Left unchecked, elites competed through banquets the way influencers compete today. Bigger spreads, rarer foods, more exotic imports, louder signals of success. Rome had seen where that ended, and it wasn't stability.
This wasn't harmless indulgence. It destroyed families. Senators bankrupted themselves trying to keep up appearances, then tried to claw their way back through bribery, corruption, and just enough political sabotage to destabilize the system without openly burning it down. Rome had already seen this story before, and it didn't like how it ended. So the state intervened. You were allowed to host a dinner, but it had to be a reasonable dinner. There were limits on meat, restrictions on luxury ingredients, and caps on extravagance, especially during certain seasons. Yes, Rome genuinely told its elites to relax with the peacock tongues. This wasn't about sparing the poor from jealousy. It was about protecting the republic from elite self-destruction. When powerful families competed socially, alliances shattered, debts piled up, politics became poisonous. Rome understood something very clearly. The fastest way to kill a republic is to let its elites spiral into status addiction. There was also a moral angle, or at least Rome's version of one. Excessive luxury was believed to weaken discipline. Soft men made bad leaders, and nothing screamed weakness quite like needing 7 courses just to feel important. Naturally, Romans hated these laws. They complained constantly. They exploited loopholes. They reclassified foods. They hosted dinners that were technically legal and spiritually criminal. Rome passed new regulations. The rich ignored them again. This cycle continued for centuries, but the intention never changed. Stop turning dinner into a political arms race. So yes, Rome limited what you could eat at your own party, not because it hated pleasure, but because it knew that when wealth competes without restraint, collapse isn't a possibility, it's a countdown. And Rome preferred boring dinners to civil war. Now, of all Roman rules, this next one is usually the moment modern readers pause, put the book down, and stare silently at a wall. In Roman society, the pater familias, the male head of the household, held extraordinary legal power. And when I say household, I don't mean just children. I mean adult sons, daughters, grandchildren, slaves, property, finances. The entire domestic universe revolved around him. Yes, even adult sons, married with children, possibly balding, were still legally under their father's authority. This power extended to finances, marriages, careers, and in early Rome, even life and death decisions. Which sounds horrifying, and sometimes was, but Rome didn't arrive here randomly. This system was born from fear. Fear of disorder, fear of divided authority, fear of households turning into miniature civil wars. Rome viewed the household as a small version of the state, and every state, in Roman logic, needed one ruler, not a committee, not a debate, not a group chat. One authority whose word ended arguments instantly. Efficiency mattered more than feelings. In a world without constant policing, without welfare systems, without bureaucratic oversight, the household had to govern itself. The father's authority ensured responsibility flowed upward. If something went wrong, debt, crime, scandal, Rome knew exactly who to blame. Accountability mattered more than fairness. And here's the part people often miss. Power came with obligation. The pater familias was legally responsible for everyone under his roof, their debts, their crimes, their survival. If the household collapsed, Rome didn't care about excuses. You failed as a leader. This structure discouraged rebellion inside the home. It forced unity. It turned families into stable economic units instead of emotional democracies. Rome wasn't trying to create happy households. It was trying to create predictable ones. Over time, the harshest abuses became socially unacceptable. Custom softened what law allowed. But the legal framework stayed, because it worked. Roman households were durable. They produced soldiers, workers, heirs, and taxpayers reliably. Which, from the state's perspective, was the entire point. So yes, Roman fathers had terrifying authority, not because Rome loved cruelty, but because Rome feared chaos more. And when forced to choose between emotional comfort and social stability, Rome chose stability every time, and then wrote a law to enforce it. Ancient Rome is famous for many achievements: roads, aqueducts, concrete, empire-wide bureaucracy, and yes, public toilets. Communal public toilets, with no stalls. Picture a long stone bench with evenly spaced holes, everyone sitting side by side, handling business, personal and conversational. This wasn't a design failure, it was Roman efficiency. And of course, Rome had rules for it. Public latrines weren't casual hangout spots, they were regulated spaces, because sanitation in a city of over 1 million people was a matter of survival. Disease didn't knock politely, it arrived aggressively and refused to leave. So Rome treated bathroom behavior as public health policy, not private reflection. There were expectations. You didn't linger, you didn't splash, you didn't cause a scene. Conversation was allowed, theatrics were not. Rome wanted order, not commentary. One of the most infamous features was the shared cleaning stick on a stick, rinsed in salt water between uses. Before recoiling too hard, remember, germ theory didn't exist. Salt water seemed clean enough, and after a few months in ancient Rome, your standards adjusted quickly. Rules existed to prevent chaos.
If people argued over seats, lingered too long, or turned latrines into social clubs, congestion followed. Congestion led to filth. Filth led to disease. Disease led to panic. Panic led to unrest. Rome did not enjoy unrest. There was also a social dimension. Latrines were shared public spaces that briefly flattened status. Senator or slave, for a moment, everyone sat on the same stone bench. Not equal in life, but equal enough for Rome to tolerate.
Rich and poor sat side by side. Senators and shopkeepers used the same stone benches. Rome liked this. It reminded everyone that no matter how rigid the hierarchy was, every citizen still passed through the same systems. No one floated above them. And yes, even waste was regulated. Human waste was valuable. It was used in tanning leather, cleaning clothes, and fertilizing fields. Taking waste from public latrines without permission could earn you a fine. Rome did not waste waste. To modern ears, Roman toilets sound horrifying. To Romans, they were engineering miracles. Running water, drainage, organization, rules. Rome didn't care whether you felt comfortable. It cared that people didn't die from preventable disease. So yes, Rome told people how to behave in the bathroom. Not because it was obsessed with control, but because without rules, even civilization starts to smell unbearable. Nighttime in ancient Rome was not romantic. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't mysterious. It wasn't for moonlit walks or quiet reflection. Night was when bad decisions showed up for work. Once the sun set, Rome became a different city. Streets were poorly lit. Buildings were packed tightly together. Fire spread fast. Criminals flourished, and political conspiracies loved darkness the way insects love exposed skin. So Rome did what it always did when faced with danger. It assumed guilt until daylight proved otherwise. Walking around at night automatically made you suspicious. Patrols watched the streets. Guards questioned people. And if you were out late without a solid reason, Rome assumed you were either planning something illegal or already doing it. This wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. Most fires began at night, when lamps and torches were used indoors. Most thefts happened when shops were closed and streets were empty. Most assassinations, ambushes, and secret meetings relied on darkness and a lack of witnesses. So Rome responded by discouraging nighttime movement altogether. If you were outside, you needed justification, work, emergencies, official duties. Wandering for personal reflection did not qualify. Rome did not recognize just going for a walk. Night watchmen held real authority. Resisting them was an extremely bad decision. Rome preferred to inconvenience innocent people rather than give criminals freedom. This philosophy came up again and again. Fire risk made it worse. Rome burned often, catastrophically often. Entire neighborhoods could vanish overnight. Limiting movement after dark reduced accidental fires and made it easier to identify responsibility when one inevitably occurred. Even elites weren't exempt. Senators traveled with escorts. Wealthy citizens stayed indoors. Darkness flattened status. And Rome despised uncertainty. To modern minds, this feels oppressive. To Romans, it felt logical. The city was too large, too crowded, and too volatile to trust the dark. Night was unpredictable, and unpredictability was Rome's greatest enemy.
So Rome treated nighttime walkers with suspicion, not because it hated freedom, but because it understood something deeply uncomfortable. Most disasters don't announce themselves. They happen quietly after dark, and Rome would rather be rude than surprised. Now here's another rule that tends to catch people off guard. In ancient Rome, suicide was not automatically illegal. What was illegal was deciding to die without first informing the state. Rome tolerated many things. Spontaneous self-destruction was not one of them. If a Roman citizen wanted to end their life, they were expected to submit a formal request explaining why. Terminal illness, irreversible disgrace, extreme suffering, loss of honor. These were considered valid. "I had a terrible week" was not. To modern ears, this sounds cruel. To Rome, it was administrative logic. Every Roman existed inside a web of obligations. Families relied on them. Debts were attached to them. Property flowed through them. Political arrangements depended on them. A sudden death, especially self-inflicted, created chaos. Disputed estates, unpaid debts, angry creditors, confused heirs, sometimes violence. Rome feared chaos more than death. By forcing citizens to explain themselves, the state filtered impulsive decisions from irreversible ones. Many requests were denied, not to punish suffering, but to prevent permanent mistakes made under pressure. Rome understood something timeless. Humans make terrible decisions when overwhelmed. Approval introduced delay. Delay created reflection. Reflection saved lives. There was also a legal consequence. Unauthorized suicide could result in confiscation of property. Families lost inheritance. Debts remained unresolved. Rome made it very clear, dying irresponsibly was financially unacceptable. Approved suicides, however, were handled with dignity. Property remained protected. Families were spared legal punishment. The act was acknowledged as tragic but orderly. Rome preferred sorrow with paperwork to chaos without it. And yes, there was a darker motive. Rome depended on citizens, soldiers, taxpayers, administrators. Allowing unrestricted self-destruction weakened the system. A state that permitted free loss of its people was, in Roman eyes, slowly bleeding itself dry. So suicide was tolerated, but only when it fit Rome's definition of reason. To us, this feels invasive. To Rome, it was maintenance. Rome didn't ask, "Are you suffering?" It asked, "Will this destabilize everything?" And if the answer was yes, the answer to you was no. Finally, there was clothing. In ancient Rome, what women wore was not considered a personal choice. It was viewed as a public statement, one the state felt fully entitled to regulate. Roman law placed limits on women's clothing, jewelry, and visible wealth. How much gold was acceptable, how elaborate garments could be, how much sparkle was allowed before society grew nervous. And yes, Rome counted. To modern minds, this sounds like moral panic. To Rome, it was damage control. The Roman elite had a chronic problem, status competition, and women's fashion became one of the fastest accelerants. Imported fabrics, expensive jewelry, extravagant presentation. One display invited a bigger one. One necklace demanded a more impressive response. Rome watched this spiral and thought, this is how republics die. So the state intervened, not to enforce modesty in a modern sense, but to slow the arms race. These laws aimed to prevent elite families from bankrupting themselves, trying to dominate social gatherings. Rome had already seen too many politicians destroy their finances, then mysteriously recover through corruption, and it had no interest in watching that cycle repeat.
There was also an issue of social clarity. Rome depended on visual order. Clothing wasn't decoration, it was information. What you wore signaled your marital status, your rank, and the behavior society expected from you. A married woman dressed modestly was read as stable, respectable, predictable. Excessive display suggested independence, and independence made Rome uneasy. Not because Rome feared women, but because it feared unpredictability. Jewelry restrictions served another purpose as well. Public gold was walking wealth, and walking wealth attracted theft, envy, and resentment. Rome preferred wealth to be discreet, locked away, recorded, traceable, and taxable. Naturally, Roman women hated these rules. They bent them. They layered jewelry creatively. They borrowed. They found loopholes. When limits tightened, hairstyles grew taller instead. Roman men complained loudly and then quietly admired the results. Lawmakers passed new restrictions. Everyone ignored them again. This cycle repeated for centuries, but the objective never changed. Rome wasn't trying to erase women from public life. It was trying to prevent status competition from turning social life into a financial blood sport. To Rome, regulating women's appearance was really about regulating pressure, and in a society obsessed with order, pressure was either controlled or it did the controlling. So yes, Rome told women what they were allowed to wear, not because it hated beauty, but because it feared what unchecked beauty did to politics. Now let's talk about gladiators. To modern audiences, gladiators looked like ancient superstars. Crowds chanted their names, graffiti praised them, merchandise carried their images. Some inspired obsessive fandom that would feel very familiar to anyone who's ever scrolled through a comment section. But Roman law took one look at gladiators and said, absolutely not. Despite their fame, gladiators were legally classified as infames, dishonored persons. This status stripped them of basic rights. They couldn't vote, they couldn't hold office, their legal testimony was restricted. In the eyes of the law, they were closer to criminals than celebrities, which only seems confusing until you remember one thing. Rome hated mixed signals. Gladiators were violent by profession. They killed or were killed for entertainment. Rome understood the danger of glorifying that too much. If violence became heroic instead of contained, it wouldn't stay inside the arena. And Rome preferred its violence organized, scheduled, and ticketed. Declaring gladiators dishonorable created a psychological firewall. You could admire them, you could cheer, but you could not aspire to become one in any socially respectable way. Rome wanted admiration without imitation. There was also a class concern. Many gladiators came from enslaved people, prisoners, or the very poor. If success in the arena granted full honor, social mobility would accelerate in ways Rome couldn't control. And Rome was many things, but flexible about hierarchy was not one of them. Even free men who volunteered to become gladiators were legally downgraded. By entering the arena, they agreed to lose status. Rome made sure the choice had consequences. You could gain money, fame, attention, but you would lose dignity in the eyes of the law. No refunds. This discouraged ambitious young men from abandoning military or civic careers to chase arena glory.
Rome needed soldiers and administrators far more than it needed influencers with swords. And yet the contradiction remained. Romans loved gladiators. They fantasized about them, gossiped about them, collected memorabilia. They even scraped sweat from gladiators' bodies to use as cosmetics. Yes, really. Rome simply refused to let admiration turn into authority. So gladiators lived in a strange limbo, loved by the crowd, dismissed by the law, famous but politically untouchable. Rome understood something deeply uncomfortable. If spectacle is rewarded with status, spectacle eventually replaces governance. And Rome was not about to let a man with a helmet and a trident run the state. Finally, there was religion. In ancient Rome, religion was not a private matter of belief, it was a public safety system. And failing your religious duties wasn't treated like a spiritual mistake, it was treated as negligence. Romans believed their relationship with the gods was transactional. Perform the ritual correctly, and the gods maintained order. Get it wrong, and suddenly crops failed, fires spread, plagues appeared, and everyone wanted to know who had annoyed Jupiter this week. So Rome enforced religious contracts, not out of devotion alone, but out of fear of consequences. Public officials were expected to perform religious rituals with obsessive precision. The correct words, the correct timing, the correct animal, the correct hand movement. Get any part of it wrong and the ritual didn't count. And if a ritual failed, it had to be repeated immediately. Because in Roman thinking, half-pleasing a god was worse than not trying at all. Private citizens weren't exempt. Promises made to the gods were legally binding. If you vowed something to a deity and failed to deliver, the consequences were very real. Fines, public shame, even punishment. From Rome's perspective, this wasn't superstition, it was risk management. Rome had no weather forecasting, no epidemiology, no disaster modeling. When famine struck, disease spread, or fires consumed the city, divine displeasure was the most reasonable explanation available. And once the explanation is divine anger, enforcement becomes urgent. Religion also served a political purpose. Shared rituals unified the population. Festivals followed known calendars. Sacrifices carried understood meanings, and when things went wrong, someone was clearly at fault for breaking protocol. Importantly, Rome didn't care what you believed internally. Belief was optional. Participation was mandatory. You could doubt the gods privately as much as you liked, as long as you performed the rituals correctly in public. Rome valued behavior over belief, a very Roman approach. Breaking religious obligations threatened collective confidence. If people believed the gods were angry, panic followed. Panic led to unrest. Unrest led to instability, and Rome did not enjoy instability. So yes, Rome punished people for offending invisible beings. Not because Rome was irrational, but because it understood that shared belief systems, however strange, are structural supports. To Rome, keeping the gods satisfied wasn't theology, it was infrastructure. Words were treated the same way. In ancient Rome, speech was not harmless. Words were tools, sharp ones. Rome understood something modern societies keep relearning the hard way. One persuasive speaker, at the wrong time in the wrong place, could do more damage than an army. So public speech was closely monitored. You couldn't simply stand somewhere and start addressing a crowd. That wasn't free expression. That was suspicious activity. Unauthorized speeches were treated as potential threats, especially if they criticized officials, stirred emotion, or promised simple solutions to complex problems. Rome had seen this pattern repeatedly. Charismatic speakers generated resentment. Resentment drew crowds. Crowds demanded action. Action turned into riots, assassinations, or civil war. Rome preferred boredom to bloodshed. Only certain individuals were allowed to speak publicly: magistrates, senators, priests, or those with explicit permission. Even then, tone mattered. Calm, measured, controlled. Shouting was discouraged. Emotional appeals raised alarms. If a speech made people feel too much, Rome started watching closely. Political speech followed similar limits. Campaigning was regulated. Personal attacks had boundaries. Large gatherings required approval. Rome wasn't trying to eliminate debate. It was trying to stop debate from mutating into mob behavior. Spontaneous crowds were treated with deep suspicion. If people gathered suddenly, authorities didn't think an inspiring idea. They thought, who is manipulating whom? There was also a class issue. The elite were trained in rhetoric. The masses were not. Allowing unrestricted public speaking risked giving power to people who were persuasive but not invested in maintaining order. Rome didn't fear ideas, it feared unpredictable influence. That's why speeches happened on raised platforms in designated spaces at approved times. Structure mattered. Control mattered. The city was already loud enough. So yes, Rome regulated speech, not because it hated expression, but because it feared what expression could become once emotion took control. Rome trusted law, it distrusted crowds, and it never forgot that revolutions often begin with someone saying, "Just hear me out." Adultery followed the same logic. In ancient Rome, adultery wasn't treated as a private relationship issue. It was treated as a public threat. Rome didn't ask, "Are you happy?" It asked, "Will this create legal chaos 3 generations from now?" Lineage mattered. Inheritance mattered. Citizenship mattered. Family alliances mattered. Everything depended on knowing exactly whose bloodline continued where. Adultery introduced uncertainty, and Rome despised uncertainty. If a married woman had an affair, the issue wasn't romance, it was legitimacy. Whose child is this? Who inherits the estate? Which family gains power? Which family loses it? One affair could unravel decades of legal planning. Rome preferred to shut that down immediately. Men, of course, were treated differently. Affairs with enslaved people or prostitutes were largely tolerated because they didn't threaten inheritance lines. Hypocritical? Yes. Perfectly aligned with Roman priorities? Also yes. Adultery involving a married woman triggered legal consequences. Husbands were expected to act. Fathers had authority to intervene. Courts became involved. This wasn't about heartbreak. It was about restoring order before gossip turned into lawsuits and lawsuits turned into violence. Elite marriages were political alliances. Affairs threatened those alliances. Rome already had enough civil wars. It didn't need domestic scandals turning into bloodshed. Public enforcement served as deterrence. By making adultery visible and punishable, Rome discouraged behavior that destabilized households. The message was simple. Romance was personal. Lineage belonged to the state. And yes, Romans gossiped relentlessly. Trials became spectacles. Reputations were destroyed publicly. Shame was a tool. Rome used it generously. To modern sensibilities, this feels invasive. To Romans, it was preventative law. Rome didn't criminalize desire, it criminalized uncertainty. Because in a society built on inheritance, names, and power, not knowing who belonged where was far more dangerous than hurt feelings. And Rome, as always, chose stability over sympathy. Even death followed this logic. Death was inevitable. Turning it into a competitive spectacle was not encouraged. Romans took funerals seriously, so seriously that they regulated them, because funerals, left unchecked, had the habit of becoming loud, expensive, emotional performances that destabilized everything. Funerals were public. Processions moved through the streets. Crowds gathered. Speeches were made. Emotions ran high. Rome had learned repeatedly that when money, grief, and crowds mix, things unravel quickly. Wealthy families were especially guilty. More mourners, more musicians, more professional criers, more gold. The dead became props in a social competition between families who desperately needed to relax. So Rome intervened. Funeral laws limited spending, attendance, procession size, and even how much gold could be buried with the body. This wasn't disrespect, it was containment. There was also an economic reason. Lavish funerals ruined families financially. Debt followed. Debt bred resentment. Resentment led to lawsuits, feuds, and occasionally knives. Rome preferred mourning to end with tears, not litigation. Public emotion was another danger. Large funerals attracted crowds. Crowds grew restless. Restless crowds listened to speeches. Speeches turned emotional. Emotional speeches turned political. And suddenly Rome had a protest disguised as a funeral. Rome had seen this before. It did not enjoy it. Limiting funeral extravagance kept death controlled, private, and predictable, which, in Rome's eyes, was the respectful way to handle it.
At first, Vincent did not aim to be great. He aimed to survive. He began drawing obsessively, copying laborers, peasants, worn faces, bent backs, hands rough from work. His early art was dark, heavy, earthbound, browns, grays, mud, coal. He was not interested in beauty yet. He was interested in truth, and truth, as he saw it, lived in exhaustion. Vincent believed suffering made people real, so he painted suffering carefully. He studied anatomy books like scripture. He practiced perspective until his eyes ached. He worked with a desperation that felt less like ambition and more like self-defense. Art was no longer expression, it was structure. Without it, his thoughts scattered. With it, they lined up just enough to function. Theo supported him financially, emotionally, relentlessly. Without Theo, Vincent does not survive long enough to matter. Their letters were lifelines. Vincent wrote constantly, explaining his ideas, his failures, his colors, his doubts. Theo listened, encouraged, paid rent, bought supplies, absorbed guilt that was never his. It was an uneven bond, but a devoted one. In 1885, Vincent painted The Potato Eaters. He thought it was his breakthrough. The world disagreed. Critics found it ugly. Viewers found it crude. Vincent was devastated, but unmoved. He had not painted peasants to impress anyone. He had painted them to honor them. If the world did not understand that, the world was wrong. Then came Paris, and with Paris, color. Impressionists shattered his palette. Suddenly, light mattered. Shadows were not black. Skin was not brown. The world vibrated. Vincent absorbed it all too quickly, too intensely. His work changed at a violent pace. Yellows exploded. Blues screamed. Lines twisted.
The canvas stopped obeying realism and started obeying emotion. This is when the art we recognize begins. This is also when Vincent begins to unravel faster. He moved to Arles, chasing sunlight, clarity, renewal. He wanted to build a community of artists, a brotherhood of creation. He invited Paul Gauguin, hoping companionship would stabilize him. It did the opposite. Their personalities clashed like exposed wires. Arguments escalated. Isolation deepened. One night, something broke. Vincent mutilated his own ear, wrapped it carefully, and delivered it like a confused offering. After that, the myth swallowed the man. Hospitals, hallucinations, fear of his own mind, periods of calm followed by collapse, and yet, in between episodes, he painted with astonishing clarity. Starry Night was not painted in madness, it was painted in restraint, during recovery, while watching chaos from a distance he feared he could not maintain. Vincent knew he was unwell. That may be the most painful part. He wrote about it openly. He feared becoming a burden. He feared wasting Theo's life. He feared that his work would never matter enough to justify the cost of his existence. In 1890, at 37, Vincent walked into a field and shot himself. He did not die instantly. Theo held him as he faded. During his life, Vincent sold almost nothing. After his death, the world caught up too late. Today, his paintings are priceless. His name is immortal. His suffering is aestheticized, packaged, admired. But the man himself never experienced the validation his work would earn. Vincent van Gogh was not destroyed by a lack of talent. He was destroyed by intensity without shelter. History loves to romanticize tortured genius. Vincent did not want to be romantic. He wanted to be useful. And maybe that is the quiet tragedy underneath the legend. He succeeded beyond imagination, just not in time to know it.
The sky he painted was not a view. It was a condition. The stars in his night scenes do not sit quietly in darkness. They surge, spiral, and press against the limits of the canvas, as if the universe itself were restless. This was not astronomy. It was psychology, rendered in light. Vincent was not painting what he saw from the window. He was painting what the night did to him. Despite the brilliance of the work, Vincent did not believe he was improving. He feared repetition. He feared stagnation. He feared that his best work was behind him, even as he was producing paintings the world would later call masterpieces. His letters during this period are heavy with doubt. He worries that his illness invalidates his vision. He worries that his art is merely the symptom of a broken mind rather than the result of disciplined seeing. Eventually, doctors encouraged a change. The asylum had stabilized him, but it had also confined him. In 1890, Vincent left Saint-Rémy and moved north to Auvers-sur-Oise, closer to Theo. He came under the care of Dr. Paul Gauchet, a physician sympathetic to artists and familiar with mental illness. The village was quiet, open, agricultural. Fields stretched endlessly. Skies felt large again. For a brief moment, there was hope. Vincent painted furiously, wheat fields, cottages, roots, ravines. The work from Auvers is restless, urgent, almost compressed by time. His brush strokes shorten, his colors darken slightly. The paintings feel unfinished, not because they lack skill, but because they refuse stillness. It is as if Vincent is racing something he cannot see. Outwardly, life seemed manageable. Inwardly, it was unraveling.
Theo's health was failing. His job was uncertain. Vincent sensed correctly that the one person holding his world together was slipping out of reach. The fear of becoming a burden returned with full force. He had spent years depending on Theo's belief. The idea that this support might weaken felt catastrophic. On July 27, 1890, Vincent walked into the fields with a revolver. What happened next was not theatrical. It was quiet, messy, human. The wound did not kill him immediately. He walked back to his room. Theo arrived in time to sit beside him. Vincent spoke calmly. He did not dramatize. He did not rage. He simply acknowledged what he believed to be inevitable. "I tried," he said, in essence, if not in exact words. He died 2 days later at the age of 37. At his funeral, his paintings were placed around the room, bright, violent with color, alive. They did not match the silence of the moment. They looked like messages sent too early or received too late. In his lifetime, Vincent sold almost nothing. In death, he became indispensable. Today, his work hangs behind glass, protected, revered, insured beyond imagination. His name is synonymous with genius, suffering, and authenticity. But this legacy obscures a harder truth. Vincent did not paint to be remembered. He painted to stay alive. His art was not the product of madness. It was the structure he built to survive it. The tragedy is not that he suffered. It is that the world learned to value his vision only after it no longer needed to sustain him. Vincent van Gogh did not fail at life because he was too intense. He failed because intensity was the only language he had, and the world had not yet learned how to listen. What remains is not a cautionary tale about madness or genius. It is a warning about what happens when honesty outpaces support. He found truth. He found beauty. He just found them alone. And that, more than any illness, is what finally broke him.
Recognition came slowly and cruelly. It did not arrive as vindication. It arrived as irony. In the years following Vincent's death, the world began to notice what it had ignored. Critics re-examined the canvases. Artists felt the shock of his colors, the honesty of his lines, the refusal to flatter the viewer. What once looked excessive now felt necessary. What once seemed unstable now appeared fearless. The work endured because it was never trying to please. Vincent's paintings survived not as artifacts of madness, but as records of perception pushed to its limits. They captured what it feels like to exist without filters, without insulation, without the emotional distance most people rely on to function. His art does not offer comfort, it offers recognition. That is why it still unsettles. The tragedy is not simply that Vincent died young. It is that the system required him to die before it could afford to listen. In life, his intensity was inconvenient. In death, it became marketable. Museums now preserve his work in carefully controlled environments. Temperature regulated, lighting precise, silence encouraged. The chaos has been neutralized, made safe for admiration. But the paintings themselves still resist containment. They vibrate, they press outward, they refuse calm. Vincent is often reduced to a myth: the mad genius, the tortured artist, the ear, the sunflowers. These simplifications are comfortable. They allow distance. They turn a human being into a symbol and suffering into a narrative device. But Vincent was not a symbol. He was a man
trying day after day to remain functional in a world that did not match his nervous system. He did not romanticize suffering, he endured it. He did not believe pain made him special, he believed it made him tired. What made Vincent dangerous and ultimately unsustainable was not madness, but honesty without protection. He saw too much, felt too much, and lacked the social armor required to dull either. Art was not his escape, it was his translation device. Without it, his inner world had nowhere to go, and even with it, the cost was severe. The modern world celebrates Vincent because it can afford to. It inherits the beauty without inheriting the responsibility. It consumes the results of a life spent negotiating survival without having to support that survival while it was happening. That is the uncomfortable lesson. Talent does not replace care. Vision does not substitute for support, and beauty alone does not keep a person alive. Vincent van Gogh did not fail because he was broken. He failed because the margin for someone like him was too narrow. His work remains because it tells the truth without asking permission, because it shows what intensity looks like when it is not softened for comfort, because it reminds us that sensitivity is not weakness but exposure, and exposure without shelter is dangerous. Vincent once wrote that he wanted his paintings to say what he could not say with words. They did, loudly, permanently, too late for him, but not for us. The question his life leaves behind is not why he suffered, it is why suffering like his still requires silence before it is taken seriously. His paintings endure as evidence, not of madness, but of what happens when a person keeps looking honestly at the world, even when the world does not look back. They are not monuments to despair, they are proof of effort, and that effort, fragile, unprotected, and relentless, is the most human thing he ever made. Jazz did not emerge from happiness. It emerged from survival, with memory intact. What distinguished early jazz from the music around it was not volume or speed, but freedom inside structure. European music offered form, scales, chords, instruments, discipline. African musical traditions offered something just as essential: flexibility, syncopation, communal response, and the idea that music could bend around emotion instead of containing it. Jazz fused these impulses without resolving the tension between them. A melody could exist, but it did not rule. A rhythm could lead, but it did not imprison. Improvisation was not decoration, it was authority. This mattered deeply in a society where so many people had none. In jazz, musicians made decisions in real time. They spoke through sound. They responded to one another instantly, adjusting, pushing, yielding. It was conversation without permission. A solo was not an interruption, it was a statement. Then someone else answered. This was radical without being loud about it. Early jazz musicians were not trying to invent a genre, they were solving practical problems. How do you make music when you can't read it? You listen. How do you stand out when everyone is playing the same song? You change it. How do you express something you are not allowed to say? You bend the note until it carries the message anyway. Improvisation became a survival skill. Brass bands began to loosen their grip on strict arrangements. Ragtime's structured syncopation softened into something more fluid. Blues seeped into everything, altering pitch, tone, and emotional weight. Musicians learned to play around the beat instead of on it. Time became elastic. The music breathed. In this environment, the individual mattered, but never alone.
A jazz musician was only as strong as their ability to listen. Ego without awareness collapsed the sound. Control without openness killed it. The best players learned when to lead and when to disappear. Jazz rewarded sensitivity. This was not the sensitivity of politeness or restraint. It was awareness. Awareness of timing, of mood, of the room, of the people beside you. Jazz punished rigidity. It favored those who could adapt without losing themselves. This is why jazz could not have been born in a rigid culture. It required a city that tolerated contradiction. New Orleans did. It lived with paradox daily, celebration beside grief, poverty beside artistry, structure beside chaos. Jazz carried all of it. As the music began to coalesce, certain figures emerged, not as founders but as amplifiers. Musicians who could gather these fragments and make them audible to a wider audience. Cornets and trumpets began to sing instead of march. Clarinet lines wove around melodies like commentary rather than accompaniment. Rhythm sections stopped merely keeping time and started shaping it. The music grew a personality. Yet even as jazz gained shape, it resisted being pinned down. Every performance was different. Every band sounded slightly unlike the last. There was no definitive version of a song, only interpretations. Ownership was fluid. Music belonged to the moment it was played. This unsettled people who preferred certainty. When jazz began to leave New Orleans, carried upriver and outward by musicians seeking work, it did not remain intact. It changed. It had to. Chicago hardened its edges. New York sharpened its intellect. Kansas City stretched its groove. Each city emphasized different elements, but the core remained. Jazz was not a sound. It was a method, a way of negotiating freedom within limits, a way of speaking without asking, a way of turning constraint into creativity. Critics and authorities often struggled to categorize it. Some dismissed it as noise, others feared it. Jazz blurred lines that society worked hard to maintain, between races, between classes, between composer and performer, between order and disorder. That made it powerful. Jazz did not promise resolution. It promised honesty in motion. It accepted that tension might never fully resolve and chose to live inside it anyway. Notes could clash. Rhythms could pull against each other. Beauty did not require smoothness. It required presence. In this sense, jazz was not escapism. It was confrontation with feeling, with uncertainty, with the fact that life rarely resolves cleanly but continues regardless. That is why jazz endures. Not because it is nostalgic, not because it is complex, but because it tells the truth in real time. Every solo says, "This is who I am, right now, with what I have, in this moment." No revisions, no guarantees. Like Van Gogh's brushstrokes, jazz does not smooth the experience of being alive. It exposes it. It accepts instability as a condition, not a flaw. Both emerged from intensity. Both were misunderstood before they were admired. Both refused to explain themselves, and both leave behind the same quiet challenge, not to copy them, but to ask what honesty sounds like when you stop trying to be safe.
Jazz became sharper, but it did not become tame. As it moved through Chicago, Harlem, and beyond, jazz absorbed the pressures of modern life without surrendering its core instinct. The cities demanded volume, precision, stamina. Clubs were crowded, nights were long, audiences were restless. Musicians adapted. They tightened forms, expanded harmonies, increased tempo, and pushed technique forward at astonishing speed. Virtuosity rose not from academic ambition, but from competition and survival. If you could not hold a room, you lost the job. If you could not innovate, you were replaced. This pressure produced brilliance. Trumpeters learned to soar higher. Saxophonists stretched phrases into elastic arcs. Pianists reimagined harmony as a moving architecture rather than a fixed foundation. Rhythm sections locked in with new authority, creating propulsion that could carry dancers for hours without collapse. Swing became a national language. Big bands emerged not as a rejection of early jazz, but as its expansion. What had once been intimate conversations grew into orchestrated dialogues. Arrangements gave shape, sections answered each other, solos rose from carefully built tension. Discipline and freedom learned to coexist under pressure. But even at its most polished, jazz retained its risk. A chart could collapse if a soloist pushed too far. A rhythm could fracture if the band stopped listening. Nothing was ever fully safe. This is what separated jazz from spectacle. It was alive each night. Failure was possible. That danger kept it honest. As jazz entered mainstream culture, it also attracted scrutiny and fear. Critics accused it of excess, of moral looseness, of corrupting youth. The same accusations had followed it since its earliest days in New Orleans. Jazz did not respond. It continued. Music had never needed permission. Race, however, remained an unavoidable reality. Black musicians created jazz, shaped it, and carried it across the country, yet were often denied access to the same venues, pay, and recognition as white performers. White bands gained commercial success playing music rooted in black experience. The sound traveled faster than justice. Jazz absorbed this contradiction, too. It became a site of brilliance and exclusion, of innovation and exploitation. Many musicians navigated this reality with quiet resilience. Others burned out under the weight. Jazz did not resolve injustice. It documented it indirectly, through tension, urgency, and refusal to settle. As the decades passed, jazz continued to mutate. Swing gave way to bebop. Dance music became listening music. Small groups replaced orchestras. Bebop was not an abandonment of jazz's soul, it was a tightening of it. Faster tempos, complex harmonies, angular melodies. Music that demanded attention rather than background appreciation. Improvisation became denser, more cerebral, less forgiving. This shift confused audiences who wanted comfort. Jazz was no longer trying to entertain politely, it was thinking out loud. Bebop musicians asserted ownership. They made music that could not be easily copied, simplified, or diluted. It was a declaration of autonomy in sound. Jazz once again became conversation, but now the conversation assumed fluency. From there, jazz fragmented beautifully. Cool jazz softened edges without losing depth. Hard bop returned to blues and gospel roots. Modal jazz opened space and restraint. Free jazz exploded structure entirely, asking how much could be removed before music ceased to exist. Through it all, one principle endured. Jazz remained a method, not a museum piece. It adapted because it had to, because it always had, because it was born from people who learned early that survival required flexibility, listening, and courage. Jazz never promised peace, it promised motion. It accepted instability as normal. It treated uncertainty as fuel. That is why jazz cannot die. It does not depend on a single sound, era, or figure. It lives wherever musicians choose honesty over safety, listening over dominance, presence over perfection. Like Van Gogh's work, jazz endures not because it is beautiful in a conventional sense, but because it is true. It captures the feeling of navigating life without guarantees, of responding rather than controlling, of finding freedom inside limits rather than outside them. Jazz asks the same question every time it begins. Who are you right now, and what will you do with this moment? There is no correct answer, only a response. And as long as someone is willing to answer honestly, jazz continues.
Jazz carried that approach into the late 20th century and beyond, where its influence spread far beyond the clubs and concert halls that once contained it. By then, jazz no longer needed to announce itself. Its ideas had already leaked into popular music, film scores, hip-hop, rock, and experimental sound. Syncopation, swing, improvisation, and call and response became part of the global musical vocabulary, often used by artists who had never considered themselves jazz musicians at all. Yet jazz itself never disappeared into the background. It continued to evolve in quieter, more intimate spaces. Small ensembles returned. Listening became central again. Musicians focused less on spectacle and more on nuance, texture, and interaction. A single note, placed honestly, could carry as much weight as a cascade of virtuosity. Education changed the music as well. Jazz entered universities and conservatories, gaining theory, terminology, and formal study. This preserved knowledge, but also introduced new tensions. Some feared that codifying jazz risked draining its danger. Others saw education as another tool, one more way the music could survive without surrendering its soul. As always, jazz absorbed the contradiction and moved forward. Globally, musicians reinterpreted jazz through their own histories. African rhythms reconnected with their descendants. Asian scales reshaped harmony. European classical traditions blended with improvisation. Jazz did not dominate these cultures, it listened to them. In doing so, it became less American in geography and more universal in spirit. What remained constant was the core principle established at the beginning. Jazz was still about presence, about listening closely and responding honestly, about turning limitation into possibility. Whether played in a crowded club, a concert hall, a classroom, or a bedroom studio, jazz asked the same question it always had. What do you hear right now, and how will you answer it? This is why jazz has never truly aged. Styles rise and fall, names enter and exit the canon, but the method endures. As long as musicians are willing to risk uncertainty, to speak through sound without guarantees, jazz remains alive. It was never a genre frozen in time. It was a practice, a conversation, a way of breathing through history. Portable and easily traded, a barrel of whiskey could move where wagons could not. It could be stored through winter. It could be exchanged for labor, tools, or land. In practice, whiskey functioned as currency. To tax it was not merely to regulate alcohol, it was to tax survival itself. In 1791, when the federal government introduced an excise tax on distilled spirits, it was framed in Philadelphia as reasonable and necessary. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton saw it as a test case, proof that the new government could raise revenue, service debt, and assert authority without descending into chaos. On paper, the tax appeared even-handed. In reality, it cut along class lines. Large Eastern distillers could pay the tax with money and lawyers. Small frontier producers could not. The law demanded registration,
paperwork and payment in cash, all scarce on the frontier. Compliance meant long trips to federal offices and exposure to scrutiny many settlers already mistrusted. Non-compliance meant fines they could not afford. The tax felt less like civic duty and more like punishment for geography. Resistance emerged quietly at first. Farmers ignored collectors. Paperwork went unfiled. Meetings were held in taverns and barns, not to plan rebellion, but to vent frustration and reaffirm shared grievance. The language of the revolution returned easily: liberty, representation, tyranny. The same words that had once justified independence now framed defiance. Federal tax collectors became symbols rather than men. They represented distant power intruding into local life. Harassment escalated. Collectors were threatened, chased away, sometimes tarred and feathered. Courts were boycotted. Compliance became socially dangerous. Refusal became a badge of belonging. What distinguished this unrest from earlier protests was its persistence. This was not a single riot sparked by rumor. It was sustained resistance, organized enough to undermine enforcement, yet diffuse enough to evade easy suppression. Western Pennsylvania existed in a gray zone, neither openly rebellious nor obedient. For President George Washington, this ambiguity posed a serious problem. The new government could not afford to appear optional. If federal law applied only where convenient, the Constitution would be a suggestion, not a foundation. At the same time, using force against citizens risked confirming every fear the rebels held about centralized power. For months, Washington hesitated. He issued proclamations. He sent negotiators. He hoped persuasion might succeed where coercion would fail. But resistance hardened. By 1794, federal officials concluded that authority itself was being challenged. The decision that followed would define the young republic. Washington called up a militia force larger than any he had commanded during the Revolution. 13,000 men were mobilized. The message was unmistakable. The federal government would enforce its laws. The army marched west not to fight a battle, but to make a point. By the time it arrived, resistance had already begun to collapse. Faced with overwhelming force, most rebels dispersed. There was no climactic showdown, no heroic last stand, only arrests, oaths of loyalty, and quiet retreat. The rebellion ended not with bloodshed, but with precedent. For the first time, the United States government had demonstrated its willingness and ability to use force against its own citizens to uphold federal law. Order had been asserted. The Republic had survived its first internal test. Yet victory came with complications. While authority was established, resentment lingered. Many on the frontier felt unheard, coerced rather than convinced. The tax itself remained deeply unpopular and would eventually be repealed. Enforcement had succeeded, but legitimacy remained fragile. The Whiskey Rebellion revealed a fundamental tension that would echo throughout American history: the balance between liberty and authority, between local reality and national policy, between laws written in distant rooms and lives lived far from them. Like jazz centuries later, the nation was improvising under pressure, testing structures against lived experience, discovering which rules could bend and which would break. The rebellion was not simply about whiskey, it was about who the Republic was for, how power would be exercised, and whether dissent would be answered with dialogue or force. The United States endured, but it did not resolve the question. It learned instead how to live inside it.
Washington chose enforcement, not because he loved authority, but because he feared anarchy more. The Republic, he believed, could not survive if it hesitated at its first serious challenge. Authority unused would quickly become authority denied. In the summer of 1794, he issued a proclamation calling on the rebels to disperse. When it was ignored, he moved to action. Militia units were summoned from 4 states. Nearly 13,000 men assembled, a force larger than any Washington had commanded during the Revolutionary War. The scale was deliberate. This was not a police action. It was a statement. Washington did something else unprecedented. He personally accompanied the troops for part of the march west. The symbolism was unmistakable. This was not a distant bureaucracy acting in abstraction. The authority of the Constitution was embodied in the most trusted figure in the nation. As the army advanced, resistance collapsed almost as quickly as it had formed. The sight of overwhelming force stripped rebellion of its romance. Farmers returned home. Meetings dissolved. Liberty poles came down. By the time the militia reached the heart of resistance, there was no army to confront, only scattered defiance and quiet fear. Arrests were made, though fewer than expected. Those detained were marched east more as a proof of capacity than as an attempt at punishment. In the end, only 2 men were convicted of treason, and Washington pardoned them both. The message had already been delivered. Mercy now reinforced legitimacy. The Whiskey Rebellion ended without a decisive battle, but its consequences were profound. For the first time, the federal government had proven it could enforce its laws across state lines and against popular resistance. The Constitution was no longer theoretical. It had teeth. Yet the victory was incomplete in ways that mattered. The tax remained deeply unpopular and difficult to collect. Within a decade, it was repealed. Political power shifted. Jeffersonian Republicans rose by channeling frontier resentment into electoral change rather than armed defiance. Authority had been asserted, but persuasion would still be required. What the rebellion truly revealed was the nature of the American experiment. The nation would not be held together by shared enthusiasm alone. It would be negotiated constantly through tension between center and periphery, between policy and lived reality. Like jazz centuries later, the Republic learned through improvisation. Structure existed, but it had to respond to human pressure. Too rigid, and it would snap. Too loose, and it would dissolve. The Whiskey Rebellion was the first time that balance was tested under real strain. It showed that power could be exercised without becoming permanent repression. It also showed that authority, once demonstrated, could afford restraint. The army marched west. It did not stay. The frontier did not forget the lesson. Neither did the government. From that moment forward, Americans understood something new. Dissent was possible. Protest was legitimate. But armed resistance against federal law would be met, not debated. The boundaries of the Republic had been drawn not just on maps, but in action. The United States survived its first internal crisis not because everyone agreed, but because disagreement had limits. Those limits would be challenged again and again across centuries, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently. The Whiskey Rebellion was not an aberration. It was a template. A nation, like a music, finding out how far it could bend without breaking. Over time, the Whiskey Rebellion settled into American memory not as a dramatic uprising, but as a quiet turning point. It lacked the romance of revolution and the scale of civil war, yet its influence ran deeper than either at that early stage. It clarified something fundamental about the nature of the new nation. The United States would not survive by avoiding conflict, it would survive by absorbing it. The rebellion demonstrated that power in a republic is not proven by silence, but by response. The government did not crumble when challenged, nor did it lash out blindly. It asserted itself, then stepped back. That rhythm, force followed by restraint, became part of the country's political DNA. Equally important, the episode revealed that resistance itself was not treason by default. The farmers were not foreign enemies, they were citizens testing the limits of authority, much as Americans had done a generation earlier against Britain. The difference was no longer who resisted, but how disputes were resolved. Guns gave way, slowly and imperfectly, to ballots. In that sense, the Whiskey Rebellion marked the end of the Revolutionary Era and the beginning of something harder, governance. Revolution thrives on clarity. Government lives in ambiguity. It must balance law and legitimacy, strength and trust, enforcement and consent. The rebellion forced the young republic to confront those tensions before they became fatal. Nothing about the outcome was clean. The tax failed, resentment lingered, power frightened as much as it reassured, but the system held. It bent without breaking. The Whiskey Rebels lost their immediate fight, yet they shaped the future by exposing the cost of ignoring lived reality. Washington won the confrontation, yet he limited his victory to preserve unity. Jefferson repealed the tax, yet he inherited a stronger presidency because of it. Each side, knowingly or not, contributed to a more durable republic. That is why the Whiskey Rebellion matters. Not because barrels were taxed or buildings burned, but because it was the first moment the United States discovered what kind of country it was becoming. Not an empire enforcing obedience from afar, not a loose alliance dissolving at the first disagreement, but a nation learning, painfully, how to argue with itself without tearing itself apart. The rebellion ended quietly. Its lesson did not. From that point forward, American history would follow the pattern it established: conflict, resistance, enforcement, adjustment. Over tariffs, slavery, labor, civil rights, and beyond, the same question would return in different forms. How much power is necessary to hold a nation together? And how much restraint is required to keep it worth holding? The Whiskey Rebellion was the first time those questions were asked, not in theory, but in action. In textbooks and public speeches, the Whiskey Rebellion is remembered as a hinge point in American history. It marked the first time the federal government tested itself against armed internal resistance and emerged intact. The drama did not lie in bloodshed, but in what followed: strength, restraint. For frontier communities, daily life largely continued. Distilling went on. Barter remained essential. The feeling of distance from the capital never disappeared, but it softened. The government now felt tangible, not just an idea written on parchment, but a force that could arrive, act, and then withdraw. Politically, the rebellion redirected dissent. Americans learned that protest carried greater power when expressed through elections and institutions rather than rifles. Newspapers replaced liberty polls. Campaigns replaced resistance committees. Conflict did not vanish, but its battlefield shifted. Perhaps the most lasting legacy was psychological. The United States confronted itself and chose cohesion over fragmentation. It tested the boundary between liberty and law and discovered that neither could survive alone. Authority required limits. Dissent required channels. The Whiskey Rebellion ended quietly, yet it left behind a durable grammar for governance: how to assert power, when to loosen it, and why legitimacy matters more than victory. The rebellion is often remembered for its imagery: farmers in revolt, militias on the march, a president riding west. But its deeper importance lies in what it revealed about the American experiment at its most fragile stage. This was not merely a disagreement over taxes. It was the first moment the United States had to decide what kind of nation it intended to become. Two revolutionary ideals collided: liberty, the belief that government exists only by consent and must remain close to the people; authority, the belief that laws passed through constitutional process must apply to everyone or lose meaning. Neither idea could fully retreat. That balance made the moment extraordinary. The federal government proved it could enforce law without descending into terror. The rebels demonstrated that resistance could be loud and disruptive without destroying the nation. No foreign armies arrived. No state broke away. The republic bent, but it did not break. For George Washington, the episode established a lasting principle: civilian government, not mobs, not generals, would rule. His restraint